She's lying, Dad. She's always hated me. Those words slid from Lena's mouth like a blade wrapped in silk. My stepdaughter's voice trembled just enough to sound wounded, just enough to make the accusation believable. Her eyes shimmered with carefully practiced innocence. And Daniel, my husband, the man I had built a life with for nearly 7 years, stood in the center of our living room staring at me as if the verdict had already been decided, as if I had already been found guilty. My name is Victoria Hale. I'm 42 years old, and I learned the hardest lesson of my life on an ordinary Tuesday evening, that betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it sleeps beside you. Sometimes it calls you family. Sometimes it's the man wearing your wedding ring and the daughter he refuses to question. You'd think that years spent building a home together would count for something. You'd think shared dinners, late-night conversations, and all the quiet compromises that make a marriage work would build enough trust to survive one ugly accusation. But trust, I learned, can collapse faster than glass. All it takes is the right lie, and the right person willing to believe it. That night, the living room lights felt painfully bright. The silence was worse, heavy, suffocating, impossible to escape. Daniel stood near the coffee table, shoulders tense, his jaw set in that rigid line I recognized from arguments long ago. Behind him stood Lena, his 20-year-old daughter from his first marriage. Arms folded, chin slightly lifted, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. For years, Lena and I had maintained a fragile peace. Not affection, not warmth, just tolerance. I had entered her life when she was 13, an awkward age already thick with resentment and rebellion. I tried to be patient. I tried to be understanding. I paid for tutoring when she struggled in school. I helped cover her tuition when she decided on college. I sat through birthday dinners where she barely acknowledged my presence. I told myself it would get better. That time would soften things. That eventually she would see I was trying. But some resentments don't fade. They deepen, and Lena had been feeding hers for years. Now she stood behind Daniel like a victorious witness, and Daniel looked at me like I was a stranger. "Victoria," he said quietly. My stomach tightened. The way he said my name, flat, distant, sent a chill across my skin. "Yes?" I asked carefully. His eyes flicked briefly toward Lena, then back to me. "Pack your things." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. The words seemed to hover in the air, unreal and impossible. "Excuse me?" His expression didn't soften. "I can't do this anymore." My heartbeat stumbled. "You can't do what?" Lena sniffed softly behind him, like someone fighting back tears. "She's been undermining me for months," she said, her voice fragile. "You just never wanted to see it." I stared at her. "Undermining her? What are you talking about?" I asked, confusion sharpening my voice. She looked down, shaking her head like she was too hurt to continue. Daniel stepped forward slightly. "She told me everything." Something in my chest tightened. "Everything about what?" His eyes hardened. "About the things you've been saying to her." A slow disbelief spread through me. "What things?" "That she's a burden," he said. "That she's ruining our marriage. That you wish she'd just move out and disappear." For a second, I genuinely thought he was joking. Then I saw the anger in his eyes, and realized he believed it. "Daniel," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I have never said that to her." Lena let out a quiet laugh that sounded like a broken sob. "Of course you'd deny it." I turned toward her. "Because it's not true." She lifted her chin slightly. "You told me I was poison to this family." "I did not." "You said Dad would be happier without me." "I never—" "Stop," Daniel snapped. The word cracked through the room like a whip. Both of us fell silent. His gaze was fixed on me now, cold, unyielding. "I'm not interested in listening to you attack my daughter." The sentence landed like a punch to the ribs. "I'm not attacking her," I said quietly. "I'm defending myself." He shook his head. "You're proving exactly what she told me." The realization hit me then. He had already chosen a side. And it wasn't mine. "Daniel," I said, my voice softer now, "you've known me for 7 years." "Yes. You know I wouldn't say something like that." Lena shifted behind him. Manipulators always sound calm when they're lying. My hands curled into fists at my sides. I looked back at Daniel, waiting, hoping, begging silently for him to recognize how absurd this was. But he didn't. Instead, he repeated, "Pack your things." The finality in his voice made the room feel suddenly smaller. "Are you serious?" I asked. "You're throwing me out because she said something?" He didn't answer immediately, and that silence told me everything. His eyes drifted toward Lena again. The way they softened when he looked at her felt like a door slamming shut inside my chest. In that moment, I understood something brutal. I wasn't his priority. I wasn't even his equal. I was optional. "You didn't even ask me what really happened," I whispered. Daniel rubbed a hand across his face. "She's my daughter." The words were quiet, but they carried absolute loyalty and absolute judgment. I felt something fragile inside me crack. Right, I said softly. Behind him, Lena's smirk returned. Just for a second. But it was enough. I didn't argue anymore. What would have been the point? So I went upstairs and started packing. Every folded shirt felt like a goodbye. Every pair of shoes dropping into my suitcase sounded like betrayal echoing through the room. When I carried the suitcase downstairs, Daniel was standing near the door. Lena leaned against the wall beside him, watching me with open satisfaction. I stopped for a moment in the middle of the living room. The house looked different suddenly. Colder, like it had already erased me. "Goodbye, Daniel," I said quietly. He didn't respond. I opened the door. The night air hit me like ice. As I stepped outside, I caught a glimpse of the living room window reflecting the light behind me. And in that reflection, I saw Lena smiling, triumphant. The door closed behind me with a dull click. And just like that, my marriage was over. But what neither of them understood yet was that the story they had just started was far from finished. The first week after Daniel threw me out of the house felt like living inside a fog. I slept in the spare bedroom of my friend Marissa's apartment, staring at a ceiling fan that ticked softly every time it rotated. Nights were the worst. That was when the silence grew loud enough to fill the entire room. Every time my phone lit up beside the bed, a small part of me hoped it was Daniel. An apology. A message saying he had realized something didn't make sense, that he had asked Lena questions, that he knew I would never say the things she accused me of. But those messages never came. Instead, the notifications that appeared were far less subtle. Screenshots, posts, little digital knives. Lena had always loved social media. The moment she felt victorious, she couldn't resist showing it. The first post appeared 2 days after I left the house. Some people spend years pretending to be something they're not. Eventually, the truth comes out. There was no name attached to it, but there didn't need to be. Anyone who knew the situation understood exactly who she was talking about. The second post was worse. A selfie of her smiling in the living room, the same living room where my life had collapsed, with the caption, "Some people finally learned their place." I stared at that post for a long time. At first it hurt. The humiliation, the cruelty, the way she twisted the knife publicly. But then something unexpected happened. The pain began to change. Pain is a strange teacher. It has a way of sharpening things. By the end of that first week, I realized something important. Lena's lie didn't destroy my marriage. Daniel's decision did. He could have asked questions. He could have demanded proof. He could have looked at me and said, "Victoria, tell me what really happened." But he didn't. He chose blind loyalty over truth. And in doing so, he threw away years of trust like they meant nothing. That realization changed something inside me. The version of me who had stood in that living room begging to be believed slowly disappeared. By the second week, I stopped crying. I stopped replaying the argument in my head. I stopped imagining Daniel realizing his mistake. Instead, something colder settled in. Clarity. One morning, I woke before sunrise and sat at Marissa's kitchen table with a cup of coffee. The city outside the window was quiet, wrapped in pale blue dawn. That was when I opened the old document box I had brought with me when I left the house. Daniel had always teased me about that box. "You keep more paperwork than a bank," he used to joke. Inside were years of records, financial statements, contracts, tax filings, investment summaries, and something far more important, proof. When Daniel first started his consulting business 5 years earlier, it had existed as nothing more than an idea scribbled across a napkin during dinner. He had the experience, he had the vision, but he didn't have the capital to launch it properly. I did. At the time, I didn't think of it as an investment. I thought of it as supporting my husband. So I transferred savings, paid early expenses, helped cover office rent during the first 6 months when the business barely broke even. I even helped him draft early client proposals when he was overwhelmed. But Daniel always told people it was his business, and I never corrected him, because marriage wasn't supposed to be a competition. Now, sitting in Marissa's quiet kitchen, with that box open in front of me, I realized something Daniel had apparently forgotten. Every transfer had documentation. Every expense had receipts. Every contract had signatures, including mine. I wasn't just the supportive wife. I was a financial contributor, a silent partner in the life we had built. The more documents I reviewed, the clearer the picture became. The house deed listed both of us. The investment accounts carried both our names. Even the early contracts tied to his company referenced joint contributions. For years, Daniel had treated my role like background support. But legally, the reality was very different. I closed the box slowly. And for the first time since that night, I smiled. Not out of cruelty, out of understanding. By the third week, my routine had changed completely. I woke early, went for walks along the river near Marissa's apartment, cooked simple meals, and started making lists. Calm, methodical lists. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. That was also when I met with Jonathan Price, a lawyer I had known since university. We met in his office on a quiet Thursday afternoon. He listened carefully while I explained everything. The accusation, the confrontation, the way Daniel had forced me out of the house without a conversation. When I finished, Jonathan leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Well," he said slowly, "that was incredibly foolish of him." I raised an eyebrow. "Why?" He tapped the stack of documents I had brought. "Because this is not the paperwork of a woman who has no claim." He flipped through pages. Bank transfers, property records, business funding. When he finally looked up, his expression carried something close to admiration. "Victoria, you helped build that entire life." I nodded once. "I know." "And legally," he added, "you have every right to claim your share." The word share echoed in my mind long after I left his office. That evening, I returned to Marissa's apartment with a new sense of calm. The fog had lifted. I knew exactly what came next. 3 days later, Daniel appeared at the apartment door. I opened it to find him standing in the hallway, hands shoved awkwardly into his coat pockets. He looked tired, uncertain. "Victoria," he said softly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. "I think we both need some time to reflect." Reflect. The word sounded almost insulting. "I've had time," I said quietly. He nodded quickly. Good, because maybe it's time you came home." I stared at him. "Came home?" "Yes," he said, relief creeping into his voice. "We can move past this, but you need to apologize to Lena first." The audacity of that statement almost made me laugh. He believed I would crawl back, that I would accept the humiliation just to return to the life we had built. Instead, I stepped back into the apartment and picked up a sealed envelope from the hallway table. When I returned, I placed it in his hand. "What's this?" he asked. "Reflection," I said calmly. He opened the envelope slowly. His eyes moved across the first page, then froze. The color drained from his face. At the top of the document, printed in bold letters, were 2 words: divorce petition. For the first time since our marriage began, Daniel looked genuinely stunned. "Victoria," he whispered, "this is ridiculous." "Is it?" I asked quietly. "You're upset," he said quickly. "We don't need to take things this far." Before I could respond, footsteps sounded in the hallway. A second later, Lena stepped into view from the stairwell. "Well," she said coldly, "looks like she finally realized she wasn't wanted." She moved to stand beside her father, arms crossed, eyes glittering with that same poisonous satisfaction. "Good," she added. "Let her go." I watched them both for a moment, and in that silence, something shifted. The first cracks in their perfect alliance had just begun, and neither of them realized it yet. Daniel stood frozen in the hallway outside Marissa's apartment, the divorce papers trembling slightly in his hands. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched thin between us, fragile and sharp like glass. Lena broke it first. "Good," she said with a dismissive laugh. "Sign it and get it over with. Dad, you're better off without her anyway." Her words floated through the hallway like smoke. Daniel didn't answer her. He was still staring at the documents. His brow furrowed deeper with every line he read. "This," he said slowly, "this is insane." He looked up at me, confusion turning into irritation. "You're filing for half the house?" "Yes." "And half the investment accounts?" "Yes." His eyes widened. "And—" He stopped suddenly as he reached the final section. For the first time since arriving, genuine alarm flickered across his face. "You're claiming ownership in my company?" I tilted my head slightly. "Your company?" "It is my company," he snapped, his voice rising. Lena stepped forward immediately, arms crossed, her expression full of scorn. "You're unbelievable," she said to me. "You're just trying to steal from him now." I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. Daniel looked between the two of us, clearly expecting me to back down. I didn't. Instead, I leaned lightly against the doorframe, completely calm. "Daniel," I said quietly, "do you remember the first 6 months after you launched the consulting firm?" His jaw tightened. "That has nothing to do with this." "It has everything to do with this." He didn't respond. So I continued. "You remember the office rent you couldn't cover during the first quarter?" "That was a loan." "Yes," I said evenly, "a loan that came from my savings. And I paid it back. Partially." The hallway grew very quiet. Lena scoffed loudly. "Oh my God, you're really doing this." I ignored her. "Do you remember the 3 client contracts that kept the company alive during that first year?" Daniel's expression shifted slightly. "They were my clients. They were introduced through my contacts." His mouth opened, closed again, because we both knew that part was true. For years, Daniel had described his success as the result of hard work and persistence, which wasn't wrong, but it also wasn't the whole story. I had simply never insisted on telling the rest. Now the truth was finally being spoken. "You helped," he said stiffly. "That doesn't make you an owner." I shrugged lightly. Legally, the documents say otherwise. That was when Lena stepped forward again, her voice rising with fury. You're just greedy. The accusation echoed down the hallway. You never loved him, she continued bitterly. You just wanted his money. For the first time, I laughed. A soft, almost tired sound. Funny, I said calmly. I'm not the one who destroyed a marriage with a lie. Her face flushed instantly. I didn't lie. Daniel lifted a hand toward her. Lena? No, she snapped. She's trying to manipulate you again. I watched the exchange quietly. Something subtle had shifted. Before, Daniel had stood firmly between us. Now he looked uncertain, uneasy. The confidence he had carried 3 weeks earlier was gone. In its place was something more fragile. Doubt. I stepped forward slightly. You'll hear from my lawyer soon, I said. Daniel looked at me sharply. Victoria. But I had already started closing the door. The last thing I saw before the latch clicked shut was Lena glaring at me like she wanted to tear the walls apart, and Daniel standing beside her, holding the divorce papers like they had suddenly become much heavier. 3 days later, the official court summons arrived. Jonathan moved quickly, much faster than Daniel expected. The filing included everything: division of marital assets, financial disclosures, claims tied to Daniel's consulting company, bank accounts, property, investment portfolios, everything we had built together over the years. When Daniel realized the full scope of the filing, the phone calls started. First came the polite ones. Victoria, we need to talk. Then the irritated ones. This is unnecessary. Then the desperate ones. You're making a mistake. I didn't answer a single call. Every unanswered ring was a reminder. He had thrown me out without a conversation. Now he would face the consequences without one. Lena, however, had no such restraint. Her social media turned into a battlefield. Posts appeared daily. Insults, accusations, subtle attempts to portray me as a bitter ex-wife trying to ruin her father. But the more she posted, the more it backfired. People started asking questions. Quiet ones. Why would someone lie about something like that? Why would a woman walk away from a marriage only to fight for her legal rights? The narrative Lena had carefully crafted began to wobble, and she hated that. The first time Daniel and I saw each other again was outside the courthouse. It was a gray morning. Cold wind swept across the courthouse steps as people moved in and out of the building. Daniel stood near the entrance when I arrived with Jonathan. He looked older somehow, like the past few weeks had drained something out of him. When he saw me, he stepped forward quickly. Victoria, wait. Jonathan paused beside me but said nothing. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. I studied him for a moment. Do what? Destroy everything. I tilted my head slightly. Everything? His voice tightened. Think about what we built. The sentence hung between us. I nodded slowly. Yes. He seemed relieved. Exactly. Then I finished the thought. We built it. His expression faltered. Not just you, I continued calmly. Not just Lena. Jonathan shifted slightly beside me, clearly impressed by my composure. Daniel shook his head in frustration. You're blowing this out of proportion. Before I could respond, Lena's voice cut through the air behind him. She just wants money. She stood a few steps away, arms crossed, eyes burning with hostility. You never loved him, she said coldly. You only cared about what he could give you. I looked at her for a moment, then said quietly, I'm not the one who lied to destroy a marriage. Her entire body tensed. You... Lena, Daniel interrupted sharply. For the first time, his tone toward her wasn't protective. It was irritated. A small crack, but a real one. She noticed it too. Her glare shifted between us. Whatever, she muttered bitterly. Jonathan checked his watch. We should go inside. I nodded once. As we walked toward the courthouse doors, Daniel called after me. Victoria. I stopped but didn't turn. You're going to regret this. For a moment, I considered responding. Then I simply said, no, and stepped inside, because the truth was simple. I had already lost everything that mattered. Now I was only taking back what was mine, and this war had only just begun. Courtrooms have a strange kind of silence. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of judgment. The kind that hangs in the air like a held breath, waiting for something to break it. The first hearing began on a Monday morning. I arrived early with Jonathan. Across the room, Daniel stood near the hallway leading to the courtroom. He looked exhausted. Not physically worn out, but drained in a deeper way. His suit was neat but slightly wrinkled, like he hadn't slept well. When he noticed me, something almost like regret crossed his face. Then Lena appeared beside him. Her posture stiffened instantly when she saw me. The moment she stood there, whatever softness had appeared in Daniel's expression disappeared. Jonathan leaned toward me slightly. Ready? Yes. And we walked into the courtroom. The hearing itself moved slowly at first. Procedural arguments, financial disclosures, initial statements. Daniel's attorney tried to frame the case in the simplest terms possible: a bitter divorce where an angry wife was attempting to seize more than her fair share. Jonathan let them talk. Then he began introducing documents, one by one, methodically. First came the early financial transfers, bank statements showing my personal savings funding Daniel's consulting business during its first 6 months. Then the office lease payments. Then the contracts. Emails between Daniel and me discussing client strategies. Receipts for marketing costs I had paid. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the story Daniel had tried to simplify. I wasn't just a supportive spouse. I had been deeply involved in building the business. Daniel's lawyer tried to dismiss it. Occasional financial assistance between spouses is common, he argued. Jonathan smiled politely. Occasional assistance, he replied calmly, does not usually involve six-figure financial transfers. A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Lena sat in the gallery behind him, glaring at me. By the time the hearing reached cross-examination, the tension in the room was obvious. Daniel was called to the stand. He sat stiffly in the witness chair. Jonathan approached slowly, calm, precise. Mr. Hale, he began, when did your consulting business officially launch? Daniel cleared his throat. 5 years ago. And who funded the initial operating costs? Daniel hesitated. A combination of personal savings and loans. Jonathan nodded. Could you clarify the source of those personal savings? Daniel glanced briefly toward Lena, then back at Jonathan. My wife contributed some funds. Jonathan lifted a document. This transfer alone was $80,000. Daniel's jaw tightened. Yes. And here, Jonathan continued, is an additional $40,000 transferred 3 months later. The courtroom fell completely silent. Jonathan set the papers down. So, Mr. Hale, would it be fair to say your wife played a significant role in launching the business? Daniel shifted in his seat. She helped. Jonathan nodded once, then moved on. Let's discuss the events that led to the end of your marriage. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. You removed your wife from the marital home 3 weeks before this filing, correct? Yes. Did you conduct any investigation into the accusation that led to that decision? Daniel frowned. I trusted my daughter. That wasn't the question, Jonathan said calmly. Did you investigate the claim? Silence stretched across the courtroom. Daniel's eyes flicked toward Lena in the gallery. She stared back at him, her jaw tight. He swallowed. No. Jonathan nodded slowly. So you removed your wife from the home without asking for her explanation? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Jonathan repeated this question. Without any proof? Daniel finally said quietly. Yes. The word landed heavily in the room. Even Lena shifted slightly in her seat. Jonathan stepped back. No further questions. After the hearing ended, people began filing out of the courtroom. Daniel avoided my eyes as he walked past, but Lena didn't. She followed me all the way into the parking lot. Her footsteps were sharp against the pavement. You think you're winning, she said bitterly. I turned slowly. She stood a few feet away, her face tight with anger. You're pathetic, she continued. My dad will never forgive you for this. For a moment, I studied her. This young woman who had spent years resenting me, who had finally succeeded in driving a wedge through my marriage. But something in her expression had changed. The smug certainty was gone. Now there was unease. He doesn't have to forgive me, I said calmly. Her brow furrowed. What? One day, I continued quietly, he's going to realize who actually destroyed his marriage. Her lips parted slightly. And it wasn't me. For the first time since this nightmare began, Lena had no response. I got into my car and closed the door. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. Because revenge doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes the truth simply unfolds on its own. The cracks between Daniel and Lena widened faster than I expected. At first, I only heard fragments through mutual friends. They've been arguing a lot, one friend said casually over coffee. Another mentioned that Daniel had started asking questions. Quiet ones. Dangerous ones. Questions he should have asked weeks earlier. What exactly did Victoria say to you? When did it happen? Why didn't you tell me sooner? Lena apparently did not respond well to those questions. For years, she had been used to absolute loyalty from her father. Now that certainty had started to wobble. The first real explosion came 2 weeks after the initial hearing. According to a mutual acquaintance who had been visiting the house, the argument could be heard from the driveway. Daniel's voice, usually calm and measured, rose in frustration. You told me she was attacking you. She was, Lena snapped back. How? Emotionally. What does that even mean? Their shouting echoed through the house I had once helped turn into a home. The same living room where Daniel had ordered me to pack my things had become a battlefield. And this time, I wasn't standing in the middle of it. I was watching from a distance, quietly, patiently. The second court hearing changed everything. The judge reviewed the financial evidence and issued a preliminary ruling. My financial contributions to Daniel's consulting business were officially recognized, which meant the company was now considered a shared marital asset. Half of it belonged to me. Daniel's face turned pale as the decision was announced. Beside him, Lena stood abruptly and stormed out of the courtroom before the hearing even ended. The heavy courtroom doors slammed behind her. Daniel didn't follow. He simply sat there staring at the table in front of him. That night, my phone lit up with a message. Daniel. Victoria, please, we need to talk, without the lawyers. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Months earlier, those words would have meant everything to me. But the woman sitting on my balcony that evening wasn't the same person who had stood in our living room begging to be believed. Eventually, I set the phone down without replying. Daniel had already made his decision. Now I was simply finishing mine. That same week, Jonathan and I prepared the final stage of the legal process. But there was one more decision I needed to make. Daniel's consulting business had grown significantly over the years. Thanks to the clients I had helped introduce. Thanks to the early financial support I had provided. The court had now confirmed that I owned half of it, which meant the profits coming from my share were legally mine. Jonathan assumed I would simply take the money. Most people would, but something inside me had shifted. This entire situation had begun with a lie. A lie used to silence me, to erase my voice, to push me out of my own life. And I couldn't stop thinking about how many other people had been pushed out the same way. Quietly, unfairly. So I made a different choice. Together with Jonathan, I arranged to transfer my share of the company profits into a charitable trust. The trust would fund scholarships for women rebuilding their lives after abusive or manipulative relationships. Every dollar taken from that business would help someone start again. Jonathan looked genuinely impressed when I told him. That's a powerful move, he said. It's the right one, I replied. Daniel found out about the trust 2 days later. Apparently, the reaction was explosive. You pushed her to this point, he shouted at Lena. Oh, please, she fired back. You're the one who married her. You lied to me. I didn't lie. Then why can't you prove any of it? The silence that followed that question must have been deafening. Their alliance, the one that had forced me out of the house, was collapsing under its own weight. And for once, I didn't need to say a word. The final hearing was scheduled for the following month. Everything was ready. The evidence, the financial rulings, the legal agreements. All that remained was the judge's decision. But by that point, the outcome almost felt secondary, because the real consequences had already begun. Daniel had lost control of the life he thought he owned, and Lena had lost the blind loyalty she once depended on. The war between them was no longer quiet, and I was no longer part of it. I was simply waiting for the final chapter to close. The final court hearing felt less like a battle and more like a funeral. Not the kind where someone lies in a coffin. The kind where something invisible dies. Pride. Control. Illusion. Daniel sat across the room, shoulders slumped. Lena sat beside him again, but they didn't sit close anymore. A small distance separated them, just enough to show something had broken. The judge reviewed the final documents carefully. Then he looked up. The court recognizes Mrs. Hale's financial contributions to both the marital property and the consulting business. Daniel lowered his eyes. The marital assets will therefore be divided accordingly. Half the house, half the investments, half the business, everything we had built together. Legally acknowledged. The gavel struck once, and just like that, it was over. Outside the courthouse, Lena was waiting. You destroyed him, she said the moment I stepped outside. I tilted my head. No, I replied calmly. He destroyed himself. Her jaw tightened. You took everything from him. I met her eyes. You helped. For a second, she looked like she might argue, but the words never came. Because somewhere deep down, she knew. Weeks passed. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm. Daniel sold the house. The consulting business began struggling. Without the quiet support I had provided, introductions, organization, financial oversight, the cracks started showing. Clients left. Revenue dipped, and Lena eventually moved out. Daniel moved into a small apartment across the city. Alone, but I didn't follow their story closely, because my own life had already moved forward. My new apartment overlooked the river. It wasn't large, but it was peaceful. Morning runs. Coffee brewed exactly the way I liked it. Books stacked beside the couch. No tension. Just space to breathe. One morning, a new email appeared in my inbox. Subject line: Scholarship recipient, thank you. The message was short. Victoria, you don't know me, but your scholarship allowed me to finish my degree after leaving a difficult relationship. I thought my life was over. Now I have a future again. Thank you. I sat there for a long moment staring at the screen, and something inside me softened. Because somewhere along the way, revenge had quietly transformed into something else. Freedom, growth, Purpose. Months later, I packed the last box of things from my old life. Inside were small relics: a ring, a spare house key, photographs from happier years. I carried the box down to the river just before sunset. The water reflected the golden light of the city skyline. For a moment, I stood there quietly. Then I whispered, "Thank you for the lesson." Not with bitterness, with peace. Because the greatest revenge had never been Daniel's downfall or Lena's regret. It was something far simpler. I walked away with my dignity, my voice, my future. And as I turned away from the river and stepped back toward the glowing city lights, I realized something that once would have been impossible. The story they tried to write for me had ended. But the story I was writing for myself was only just beginning.